Hello, I'm Craig DeRoche, CEO of Family Policy Alliance. After the overturning of Roe versus Wade in June 2022, I hope you remember how excited you were when you heard that. Many of us, though, pro-life Americans, especially Christians, began asking ourselves and others, now what? How can pro-life believers make an impact in our society? Well, folks, I am so excited about our guest today, Roland C. Warren, President and CEO of CareNet, one of the nation's largest and oldest pro-life ministries. And he's going to lay out his unique vision for the future of the pro-life movement in his groundbreaking book, The Alternative to Abortion: Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. Folks, Roland thinks like a lot of us do, that abortion for the person having the abortion isn't their problem. Guess what? We think at Family Policy Alliance, we think it's their solution. And we want them to think of other solutions. And that's what Warren writes in this book. And we're going to talk about that. His journey began during his Princeton University college years when he and his then girlfriend, now wife for over 4 decades, faced a daunting decision of abortion or choosing life for their unborn child. They chose life, and it was their 40-year journey that has led to the book that we're going to talk about. Roland joined CareNet, one of my favorite pro-life ministries, in 2012. They actually were on the second floor of the prison fellowship building when I was on the third floor working there with Chuck Colson in Lansdowne, Virginia. Warren challenged pro-life conventional pro-life strategies by recognizing the link between abortion rates and the erosion of marriage, father involvement, and discipleship. Roland, welcome to the podcast. It's great to be with you today.
Good to be with you as well.
Well, CareNet is such an amazing ministry. You're the leader of CareNet that so many of us that are listening to this show support. And you're kind of like a Chuck Colson figure, right? And that's why I think why he hired me to be at Prison Fellowship. A lot of ministries will say we want somebody who's leading the ministry to understand the skin in the game that our customers have. So why don't we start with your origin story? You're now wife of 40 plus years. Take us back in time and how you used your experience to benefit other people in this ministry.
Yeah, that's actually the first chapter of the book. My experience as an undergrad at Princeton. I was a junior. My wife was a sophomore. We found ourselves pregnant on campus. There's a way that happens. So we were Christians at the time. So it was a very difficult, period for us. And, when my wife went to student health services to get the pregnancy test, nurse delivers the test and brings it back and says, you're pregnant. And without taking an extra gulp of air says, and of course, you're going to have an abortion. My wife Yvette says, well, I don't want to have an abortion. I want to have my baby. I want to get married. And the nurse is like, well, how are you going to graduate from Princeton with a baby? It doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. And what do you want to do when you graduate? Yvette says, well, I want to become a doctor. She says, my gosh, graduate from Princeton with a baby, become a doctor with a baby. Doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. Doesn't seem like it's a wise choice. And so, I tell people all the time, like she came back to the dorm room and we just, we talked about it. And, it was interesting. The nurse was an older woman, probably a mother herself. She could have said, okay, so how do we make your choice work? How do we make that happen? Or who's the father? Where's the father? And maybe we can have him come to the next visit to support, your choice in his child. But she didn't say any of that. So there we were with some choice, really from their perspective, no choice but to have an abortion. But we didn't. We decided to get married. We did. So I was 20, she was 19. We got married by the Justice of the Peace in Princeton with about 4 students there as our witnesses. And we just sort of started our life together, had our son, who actually ended up going to Harvard. So I tell people all the time that my only fear is I can only give him the second best education that money could buy. Harvard big here.
So I love that competitiveness. It wasn't a great education, but it's a solid education you can get from Harvard. Not like Princeton.
It's solid. I mean, but anyway, but they took my money anyway. They didn't care. But anyway, yeah. So, I think, one of the things that really impressed upon me at that time, and again, I wasn't in the pro-life movement. I wasn't any of that. I'd never been to a pro-life march, the March for Life, or any of that. I was just a person dealing with this situation. And what I realized very clearly is that, with the abortion decision, the perspective is that nothing good will come from this. Like it's not even 50-50. This is a net negative for you. It's a net negative for your life. And there's nothing good that can come from this. And now Yvette and I've been married 42, be 43 years, May 1st, with a son and now, a granddaughter as a result of that and all of that. And when my wife was kind of sitting there in the nurse's office at 19, she couldn't see that. She couldn't see herself holding our granddaughter. when she's in her 60s, right? She
Right.
couldn't see that, but God could. And that's really kind of the role that we have here in terms of the work that we try to do, that despite all the uncertainty of what you don't know, focus on the certainty of what you do, that there's a life growing inside of you. And it's not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for. And essentially, that was the perspective that Yvette had. And that's the reason why we're here today. And then God used that story, all of it, to help me kind of change my perspective from being kind of pro-life, or expanded, if you will, from being pro-life to being pro-abundant life. And obviously we'll talk a little about what that
Yeah.
means.
We're trying to make it unthinkable. We're trying to meet people where they are. So sorry about the big wind up there,
Yeah.
Roland, but why Roland Warren is on this call is he's not going to dumb this down to if there's a regulation that says abortion is
Yeah.
illegal that goes away in your state. He knows that's not true. So what is CareNet helping us do to serve the
Yeah.
Lord, to meet these women where they are, where they're not worried entirely about whether it's legal or not? They need an answer, and you found a way to change the entire movement by serving people differently. Tell us about that.
Yeah. And you make a very good point. I mean, abortion, people think if you make it illegal, that it will be unthinkable, but it won't be. But if you make it unthinkable, even if it's legal, people won't do it. Right. So it really, from that perspective, it is a heart issue, and it's tied to, how we, from a biblical perspective, it's tied to how our hearts are wired in terms of our relationship with God and how we think about this issue. I tell people all the time, the first abortion actually happened in the garden, where Eve said, my fruit, my choice. And Adam stood there silently, and they sinned. and if you think about it, abortion has the same kind of dynamic when you say my body, my choice, and the guy stands there at the side. So one of the first things I did when God called me to this role, I'm a business guy by training, I got an MBA and all that kind of stuff. I started to look at this and say, what are we really dealing with? I mean, what is this issue at its core? And so it took me down this path of starting to think about why women want to have abortions to begin with, and then building a ministry response to why women want to have abortions. And so what God did was to kind of help me get a better understanding of that, is he took me to the first chapter, the first book of the New Testament, which is the birth of Christ. So you see, you got Mary here, and she's facing an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective. She has hopes and dreams and aspirations for her life that did not include a child at this time and in this way. And in the midst of all that, right, so she gets this news, and she's dealing with all this uncertainty, right? This uncertainty. Like, how am I going to tell Joseph? I mean, how am I going to tell my family? How am I going to take her this? All this uncertainty. And in the midst of all that uncertainty, what does she do? She doesn't focus on the uncertainty of what she doesn't know. She focuses on the certainty of what she does. There's a life growing inside of her, and it's not a life worth sacrificing. And then what does she do? She says, let it be unto me as you have said, and she chooses life. And so I looked at that story and said, well, got it. So here's an unplanned pregnancy. And I realized that my wife, even though the way she got pregnant was very different, the practical circumstances were exactly the same. Hopes and dreams and aspirations for her life that did not include a child at this time and in this way. And she chose life. And so essentially the work that we're trying to do is to encourage women to tap into their inner Mary, to ascribe to themselves the virtue and the character of Mary. For a lot of folks, they say, Roland, got it. Doesn't sound that different. So what we're supposed to do is kind of help the proverbial Marys and save the proverbial Jesuses. But you got to keep reading. What did God do to make sure that Mary's unplanned pregnancy wasn't a crisis pregnancy? Well, he sent an angel to Joseph, and Joseph was a man, and Joseph had a plan, and he thought it was a good plan, which was to divorce her quietly, to put her away quietly. Why was that? See, back then, you couldn't put the baby away, so you put the woman and the baby away. It was essentially a cultural version of an abortion. And the angel comes to Joseph and says, listen, man with a plan, I got a new plan. Be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her. So what you see in that moment is that God engaged the guy in that process. Similar thing that happened to me. God engaged me in that process. And here it gets better. When Jesus was at risk and Mary was at risk, who did God go? Who did the angel go to? Went to Joseph again, man with a plan, new plan, provide and to protect. One man, two mission, husband to her, father to the child growing inside of her, one man, two missions to provide and to protect. So there's always been a role for men when it comes to an unplanned pregnancy. So when I looked at the biblical narrative of the most celebrated unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective, and I looked at what's happening in the pro-life movement, I said, that's not what we're solving for. We're solving for helping the proverbial Marys and saving the proverbial Jesus, but we're not building family. So the first pillar of a kind of pro-abundant life perspective is actually God's design for family. Now, Why does this matter? It matters for a couple of very important reasons. Number one, when you look at that biblical narrative, the first thing that the angel told Joseph was, do not be afraid to take Mary as your what? Baby mama? It's not even the messenger version of the Bible. It was wife. So what you see in the birth of Christ is two sanctities, the sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life. And there's a priority here because the first thing that he told Joseph was not to save the Christ child. He told him first, he affirmed the sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life. So the sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life are interwoven in the biblical narrative. God created a family. Now, when you look at the data on abortion, 87% of the women that have abortions are unmarried. What does that tell you? God knew what he was doing. Now, and plus, if there's anyone who was equipped to walk this earth without an earthly father, clearly it was Jesus. But in order to make sure that God put a fine point on the centrality of his design for family, Jesus was given an earthly father. He was given an earthly father. So it would accomplish God's purpose to bring a savior into the world without violating his principle, his design for family, ideally how children should come into the world. And we as people of the book, right? This is in the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament, should be walking the way that Jesus walked, using the narrative that you see from a biblical perspective in the first chapter of the first book. So being pro-abundant life means that you're not just trying to save babies, as God honors that is, but you're trying to build families so you can break the cycle, if you will. That's the first.
This is exactly where we want to be, and this is why I'm so glad we have Roland Warren, CEO of CareNet, on with us today, and we're talking about the unique ways in which CareNet is going forward. We're talking about his new book too, and there's a link below. We absolutely want you to check out this book. If you're one of these people that is able to give of your time, your talent, your treasure to these wonderful ministries that are on the front lines of the pro-life movement, at CareNet, they're innovating and they have these wonderful stories of how they work with churches and how they work with women on the front lines. So my next question for you, Roland, leading CareNet, is what are some of the immediate things that a Christian that is listening to this podcast or hearing your voice, they say, yeah, I want to be the hands and feet. I send in checks occasionally, and I don't discount that. Folks, people accept that money because they can be your hands and feet. That's why they accept your money to work in the pro-life movement. But there's stuff you can do as well, and there's stuff your church can do. So what are the things, Roland, that you would be saying to do with their time and their talent and to bring it to their local church to connect with CareNet too? What are some of those ideas?
Yeah, the key thing is like the ministry approach, I mean, that CareNet uses is really very much focused on building our network of 1,200 plus pregnancy centers to be those first responders in many of these cases. But the reality is that we want to make sure that that woman or that man that goes to a pregnancy center doesn't go back to the culture. Because often when that happens, we see them back at the pregnancy center again with a new pregnancy and a new guy and all of that. That's actually not ministry. That's business. I know that well. That's thank you, come again. What's supposed to be happening is that person's supposed to be transitioned to the church for ongoing support and discipleship, which means that as a Christian, you need to be looking at this issue through the lens of discipleship. So the first pillar is God's design for family. The second pillar is God's call to discipleship. You know, when Roe was overturned, you know, when people started responding, well, are you ready? You know, what are we going to do? And they already talked about pregnancy centers. Amazing. It's about 3,000 pregnancy centers in the country. But the reality is there's over 350,000 churches. At least half of those churches are life affirming. And the churches actually need to have a ministry response in the church so that someone facing a pregnancy decision, particularly in the church, has a ministry response in the church in order to solve that. Because you also have to have a way for folks who are outside the church to be connected to the church for ongoing support and discipleship. Unfortunately, too many Christians view the life issue primarily through a political lens. So if you ask them, are they pro-life, and they say yes, then then they'll tell you who they voted for. Don't get me wrong, there's a political component, but this is primarily a discipleship issue. Water for the thirsty, food for the hungry, clothes for the naked, compassion for the pregnant. So there has to be a ministry response in the church. So a practical thing you do is you have in your church a ministry that CareNet calls Making Life Disciples, so that we start training small groups in the church to receive folks inside the church facing pregnancy decisions and to retrieve folks outside the church, so that that woman or man facing a pregnancy decision doesn't just save their baby, but they also become disciples of Jesus Christ, which, by the way, is exactly what happened with Mary and Joseph, right? So it's really looking at this issue through the lens of God's design for family and then God's call to discipleship. And the church is the seat of discipleship. And the other thing, a point I'll make as well, is we have so many people sitting in pews who have past abortions. And much like Peter, who aborted Jesus, because abortion is a rejection of the vulnerable life that you see, right? They feel like they can't be pressed into service here because of their guilt. And of course, when the call was to the disciples with Jesus, he said, bring Peter too. And what did he do? He restored him. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? We have so many people sitting in pews who are dealing with guilt and shame from past abortions that need to be mobilized and activated into ministry. So we've got several ministries like Forgiven and Set Free, a very large post-abortion ministry, and also Reclaiming Fatherhood for Men that's designed to help those in the pews who have an abortion in the past to be forgiven, set free, mobilized, and activated to get upstream to help folks that may be facing a pregnancy decision at that time.
Roland, I want to jump right in there because I deal with this a lot in the recovery rooms, guilt and shame, right? This is what I talked about earlier. What was my problem? If I was drinking alcohol to solve a problem, what were my problems? It was things like fear, guilt, shame, anger, pride, right? And that's the same problems that somebody has that might turn to sex or pornography. It's the same problems somebody has that might think, well, maybe I'll try a different gender out. I'll dress differently. What I'm trying to say here is we have the same problems, fear, guilt, shame, anger, and we have a whole bunch of earthly solutions we can choose from. Abortion is one of these for a common problem when a pregnancy comes up.
Yep.
As we're talking here, the bottom line is that's not about you. It's not about the person that created the person with you. It's a different person, and they have the same size hopes and dreams. They have the same civil rights that you and I have. Our country doesn't recognize that yet. But the disconnect here, Roland, I'm so grateful for the point you just made, is that our culture right now, you might still be thinking as you listen to Roland and I's voice, I wonder if these guys like Donald Trump. I wonder what they think of the Republican Party or whatever. Folks, that's not it. This is not a political issue. That is what the biggest trap that the devil's done in the last 50, 70 years is had us thinking in this term that it's politics or that it's healthcare or that it's different than pornography or gambling. It's the same trick by the same evil one for the same reasons. And we need to confront that. If you've had an abortion in your past, the evil one wants you to feel that guilt and that shame. But this is what I just wanted to jump in here, Roland, because my sponsor does this to me. It convicted me nearly 15 years ago. If you don't accept that forgiveness from God, that's pride. That's pride. If you prayed for forgiveness for your abortion, you receive that forgiveness from God. And if you are the bench, you don't want to come out, you don't want to click here, you don't want to share this because you're afraid someone's going to find out you did that in the past. The evil one is using you to glorify himself. There is no fear. No one is mad at you. Nobody has a time machine. Nearly 1/3 of women have faced this. It's okay. And if you've been forgiven, you've been forgiven, and you need to stop doing God's job and waiting until you can forgive yourself. Sorry, Roland. I just felt that there were some people out there
No, I
who
think
hear
that's
that.
totally.
And that's why I'm so glad you're doing this. And when you get that release, I want you to sign up for CareNet because, folks, that's what Chuck Colson did when he said, I know what the evil one wants. He wants me to pretend like I wasn't in prison, that I'm not a felon. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell people I broke the law and I'm set free in Christ. And when I was arrested and I blew up my life in addiction, the evil one wanted me to lie about that and say I don't have problems with alcohol and that I'm a perfect husband. I'm not. I needed God to do that. And with abortion, the fact that we're not welcoming people back into our community, that's one of the most powerful things you said, Warren. I just wanted to elevate that. So we want our churches to be the hands and feet. And folks, I also wanted to say you did not want the government and HHS departments in the states and the counties to replace this. You said the body of Christ and family. So the last question that I have for you today, Ron, we're going to have you back on real soon. We're going to have people check out your book, The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, not just pro-life. I'm on with Roland Warren, the CEO of CareNet. Tell us how we can connect with CareNet.
Okay, great. You can connect with CareNet at care- that's a dash care-dash.org, care-dash.org. To learn more about Making Life Disciples, you can go to makinglifedisciples.com and you can learn more there. And then you can find me on my website, rolandwarren.com. So the multiple ways that you can connect to us. But really, this pro-abundant life perspective is so different because it's based on John 10:10, where Christ said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And kind of a short version of that, basically, the reason why I've kind of transitioned how I think from being pro-life to being pro-abundant life is because Jesus was pro-abundant life. He said that we might, and then that's what I unpack in the book. What does that mean? Starting with John 10:10. How do you actually look at that through the lens of what Christ is saying there? And are you applying that lens when you look at the life issue? And what I found is that most Christians are not. In other issues we do, water for the thirsty, food for the hungry, clothes for the naked. But because we've allowed the life issue to become so politicized, we don't view it through that lens, even while we're sitting in the pews. And that's really what has to change. And once that changes, the gates of hell will not prevail against the abortion, if you will, of the abortion gates of hell, if you will not prevail against the Church of Jesus Christ that's walking in the fullness of an abundant life perspective in Christ and starts viewing this issue through God's design for family, God's call to discipleship. The church then leads as opposed to follows, and you exchange the podium of a politician for the pulpit of the pastor. And that's really what has to happen. And once we do that, watch out. Watch out.
Folks, now you know why. We want to have Roland Warren, CEO of CareNet, on here. From your lips to God's mouth, brother. I don't think we've had a better close of my podcast ever since we started this. Folks, we want you to be motivated here. Thank you. We couldn't have said it better ourselves. Family Policy Alliance is made up of 40 state organizations, which means we're growing. We need 10 more. You can click below. We have the links for you to connect with Roland Warren and CareNet and get involved in their wonderful ministries. We want you to read his book as well. We want you to learn about how this is different. We want you to shake off maybe any remnants of guilt and shame or fears that you have of your own experience with life. And we want you to pour that back in and use that to glorify the Lord. Roland can help show you the way. And that's what this podcast has been about. Family Policy Alliance, our family policy councils want everyone to participate in every election. We think that we should vote in 4 elections every 1 year where we live. If they're going to vote on the sidewalks or the fences or an expansion of the library, as Christians, we own that. We should be participating. Amen. The same as we do once every 4 years when there's a presidential election held. So, folks, we want you to click on the link below if you haven't done that and share that as well. It's been a privilege to be with our friends at CareNet, Roland Warren, and check out his book, and we'll see you all again next week. Blessings all.